explanation of this book and Mark and how I got together. We're colleagues at the New American Foundation, didn't know each other particularly well when we decided to do this, and we're very different people. You know, Mark is one of those, you know, entitled baby boomers. I'm you know, one of those slacker Gen Xers. Mark lives in Northern California. I live in Southern California. We both have newspaper backgrounds. So Mark was on the editorial side, and I was on the news side. But Mark actually did something that turns my stomach to think of it. He went into public service and worked in government as the deputy treasurer in the state of California. I could never do that. And worked in a political campaign, was a top policy advisor to Phil Angelides when he ran for governor in 2006. And he and I think about issues and the world and see the world in very different ways. But when it came to California in this moment that we're in, where we seem so profoundly stuck as a state, it turned out that we saw things in a very similar way and wrote this book actually relatively quickly. We share deep and abiding frustration with not just the state of what we're in, but I think what worries us and concerns us more is that the thinking and the stories that we've come to tell ourselves in California about this fix we're in are often wrong or miss the point or take us away from the solution. And there are solutions out there, and while they are politically difficult given the realities of the day, they're not all that difficult or different or radical. When you look at all the other states of the Union and all the other countries of the world, the democratic ones, and how they govern themselves. And we just wanted to create kind of a new narrative and also offer some real ideas that would advance things. So much of the narrative that we hear is blaming particular people, the legislator, particular politicians, particular governors, particular interest groups, whether it's unions or corporations, and all of those, and many of those, when the blame is cast, many times there's truth to the accusation. However, this is a state where the public and voters have profound power, and the hard truth of it is that we are all of us in this room, anyone who's voted in an election in this state, bears responsibility for the fix we're in, and the hard fact of how our system is constructed is that we all are going to have to be part of the solution if there is going to be a solution. We're a different state. We have a different history than every other place. There's a history of great suddenness to us. We're also a state that from the beginning, we didn't have a real founding. We sort of came together very quickly. There was a gold rush, you may have heard. People showed up, and we have been a state that's so focused on growing, people arriving, people creating great wealth, that we've never really had a coherent system of government, a system of government that really made sense. Our first constitution was essentially a plagiarized copy of the Iowa Constitution, which they adopted because it was very short and it was very recent at the time. And they took out all the stuff that the Iowans put in to explain how they were going to pay for things. That's essentially how we started. We struggled with that. I mean, that first constitution says the permanent seat of government in California is going to be San Jose, to tell you what it was like. We struggled with that for 30 years, called a constitutional convention in 1878. It went into 1879. It was a disaster. We ended up with an entire article of the Constitution devoted to discrimination against the Chinese, which was a problem for American foreign policy for several decades after that. And that constitutional document is the base of the one we have today. We haven't had a convention since then. What we've had since then are various attempts to fix it and then to fix the fixes. Over 500 amendments, improvisations on improvisations, and many of those improvisations sold as the silver bullet. The thing, if we just do this one thing, it'll change the dynamic and change everything. And all of those bullets, all those different suggestions and changes have constrained us, have become sort of whips and chains, particularly in our budget process, to the point where it's very hard for us to not just resolve any of the problems that we know are there, whether it's education, higher education, prisons, water, healthcare, etc. But it's not that we can't even get to addressing the issues because our system doesn't allow for timely democratic decision making. That's the brief history, and Mark's going to talk about the solutions because he's the optimist in this pairing. But let me talk about the very brief diagnosis to set this up. When you look at California, what we talk about in the book is the notion if you had an extraterrestrial come down, extraterrestrial Alexis de Tocqueville came down and described what was the California system, he would tell you, well, it's not really one system. What it is it's three systems. And they don't really work together. And that first system is an election system. Single-member districts, elections, where the winner is, one person, plurality elections, whoever, gets the most votes wins. And that's a system, a classic system that's set up that if you want to create majorities and let them rule, that's a way to turn even small numbers of votes into majorities. However, once we elect these, elect people in this majoritarian kind of system, we send them to Sacramento, where we have to govern ourselves a consensus-based system. We're the only state, as many of you probably know, where it requires 2/3 votes of the legislative body to pass a budget or raise taxes. And we actually have supermajorities for all sorts of other things. Suspending the education funding formula, certain borrowing from local government funds, some transportation money is behind supermajorities, and so on and so on. No other place does that. And that consensus principle is very much at war with the majority principle. We send these majorities up there, and the first thing they have to do is get the permission of the minority. That's tough. But if that wasn't tough enough, we have this third system, our initiative and referendum system, the most inflexible in the world. You live in the only place that I can find on planet Earth where if an initiative if law is passed by initiative, it can't be changed except by another vote of the people. Everywhere else, the legislature can amend. And our system doesn't allow any real official power to the legislative body on the front end to negotiate, to adopt pieces, to do that. I mean, that can be done informally, but not officially. And that gives us this very inflexible and also very powerful initiative process. It really allows things to be stuck into our system. And it allows the voters to sort of overrule whatever the poor saps in the majority manage to negotiate with the minority. So those three systems, which all have values, I mean, there's all things to subscribe them, but what's very clear is that they don't work together. And putting them together as we do, which is our status quo, is actually very radical. There's no other place that does these things. No other state with those 2/3, no other place with an initiative process like that, and we do all these crazy things and put them together. So, and this is where I need to hand it off to Mark. So what do we do about that, given that setup? And that's, Mark's going to solve the problem.
It requires, first of all, keeping in mind the narrative that Joe just gave about how we reached this unhappy moment in our life. And the real import of that narrative is that weak reform medicine administered only to address symptoms with little eye to how it fits with the rest of the system has never been the antidote in California. In fact, it's been the poison. So what we try to do in the book is to argue for something that California's never had. A true founding in which we put together a government rethought to make all the pieces work together. And it's a system that needs to be rethought with attention to the sheer scale of California. Because as you read the book, you'll see one of the themes that we touch on is that we've never in California really come to grips with how big we are and what that means for creating a state government. It's a very different matter to govern a state of 38 million, populated by people drawn from every corner of the globe, than it is to govern Rhode Island or Nebraska or Oklahoma. So, and in our California fix that we offer in the book, our buzzwords are democracy and accountability. We propose that windows be opened up so that Californians can see in and peer out and keep an eye on each other and on their elected officials. But this also is going to require what we call the great unwinding of all rules. So there are a lot of ways California might be fixed, and we offer in our book, what we try to do is offer one vision of what a coherent system might look like in California. And as Joe said, we don't suggest anything radical. What's radical is what we have today. Well, instead what we suggest in the book is a series of fixes of ideas and practices that are well tested elsewhere in the United States and around the world and that are proven to work, but that we put them together in California in the way that we do so much else in California. I mean, this is a culture where we take the very best from around the world and put it together. where else are there Korean barbecue tacos? From our cooking to our architecture, to our iPhones. What we do is we integrate different pieces and technologies and things and put them together, and the California genius is making them all work together. And so we try to do the same in our book, in our California Fix. We start by junking the current election system, the one of the single-member districts and the plurality, first past the post elections that Joe talked about, the system that's designed to produce just majorities. Because we know in California, from the dissatisfaction that Californians have with our legislature in particular, that system, the way it works in California, doesn't create a legislature that's either fully representative of our diversity or that voters feel is accountable. So instead we substitute a more representative legislature with its members closer to the voters. And we do so because we want to keep in mind what is political reality in California. There are a lot of reformers and pundits who dream that if we make small changes at the edge of our system, that somehow we can get back to that great era of California of the 1950s and 1960s, the golden years of Earl Warren and Pat Brown, when Democrats and Republicans alike championed public investment in education and infrastructure and worked in the legislature across party lines. That is not our reality today. This is not the California of Earl Warren and Pat Brown, where some liberals are Republicans and some conservatives are Democrats. We in California have swung our partisan affiliations in line with ideology, and we've sorted ourselves into communities of like-minded, with a blue coast, a mostly blue coast, and a solid inland of red. And there seems no end in sight in California, and indeed I think in the country, of our desire to sort ourselves into these communities of the like-minded. So any fix that we make has to recognize that as the reality, and instead be designed that we can actually govern ourselves in spite of our partisanship. We're not going to make that partisanship go away. So our electoral fix borrows some of the best practices around the world, creating multi-member districts for the legislature, using proportional representation, so a system in which every vote counts. And today, if you live, for instance, in the Bay Area and you're a Republican, you might as well never vote in the legislature because you're never going to win. Your vote doesn't count. But the same is true in a lot of inland California. There are millions of Democrats who live in the Inland Empire in the Central Valley, but they might as well not vote because the way we sorted ourselves, they never win. So our systems of proportional representation, every vote counts. You vote as a Republican in the Bay Area, you partially contribute to maybe switching one more seat in your direction, and the same in the Central Valley for Democrats. So it's a system that's more responsive to swings in voter opinion. Every vote counts, everybody has people representing them in the legislature. And this is a system that would end the issue of gerrymandering in the state, increase partisan competition. Our fix, we redo the districts, electoral system around regions of California, because California really is not just a state, it's really a nation without states, in which the North State is as different from here in Pasadena as Wyoming is from New York City. And so we need an electoral system designed to allow people to express those regional differences and to have regional conversations about their future. This new changed legislature then creates a second change, permits a second change, which is to get rid of that system that Joe talked about of whips and chains, of all those 2/3 votes. And the reason Californians have enacted those is they don't believe they can trust the legislature. So if you create a legislature that is actually representative and more trustworthy, then we can move in the direction of a system where we actually allow the people we elect to govern, which increasingly, as we've described in the book, we don't do. Those whips and chains that we have in California are going to offer as solution to our fiscal problems. But there's a reason, we argue, that California has the worst fiscal situation, is in fact those restraints that have created our problems. They're not the answer, they are the source of many of our problems. So we start with electoral reform to create trust, and when we have trust, then we allow the legislature to govern again. And then there is the third piece, which is the initiative system. And that we would change to bring it more in line with the other systems. We've changed this inflexible system so that the legislature has a role at the beginning of the process that can actually engage in discussion and debate with initiative sponsors, could offer an alternative if the sponsor, they couldn't reach an agreement on a measure, and then on the ballot offer voters a better choice. You just wouldn't have up or no on an initiative. You would also have the possibility of yes or no on an initiative, yes or no on a rival measure put on the same proposition by the legislature, and a choice between those two if both were to pass. Instead of having just a single choice, voters would have sort of 6 choices. We'd have a more nuanced conversation about issues that we have on the ballot. They'd be more comparative campaigns, be less emotional, they'd be more about the differences between what Joe proposes and what I propose. We'd have a better system. Also, we suggest making it less easy to qualify initiatives, but easier to qualify referenda, so that our direct democracy system, once we've changed the legislature to be more representative, to be more of a system where the voters get to pass judgment on the acts of the legislature. Now, this is the pattern in most of the rest of the world, in Switzerland and other places. Most measures that voters vote on are referenda about things that have been done by the legislative body. And there's a conversation. They go back and forth. The legislature passes, voters turn it down. They change it, a referendum again, maybe the second or third time it passes. It becomes less a confrontation and more of a conversation. And we also suggest that policy issues we change so that we stop doing policy in the Constitution. And one of the really big problems we have in California is it's almost as easy to amend the Constitution as it is to pass an initiative statute. So why not spend a few extra dollars and lock it away where it's almost impossible to change? And so part of our fix is also making it easier to have a conversation about policy, but harder to embed that in the Constitution. And one of Joe's favorite lines, which I steal whenever I can, is the system right now, as a young person, he feels like he's governed by ghosts. Proposition 13 passed when you were 5. The school funding guarantee it was passed in 1988 when Joe was in grade.
When I was being advised as a freshman by Mike Babcock.
Okay, in high school. Joe now has a toddler who's going to start school in 4 years. Joe feels like he ought to be able to set school policy for his own child, and the vote I made in 1988 shouldn't continue to govern what California does. So we try to imagine these things not just as individual pieces, but as a whole system. It may not be the exact answer that California needs, but we think it's the kind of conversation that California needs to have, it's never had, and we're very happy that you're all here to join. So thanks.
We'd love to hear your questions. They're in the back.
2 quick comments and then 1 quick question. I just bought the book and skimmed the bits that I thought that I was most interested in. I just wanted to endorse your first point under sensible budgeting about having some honest accounting for a change. There are really well-accepted, well-trialed models around the world of how the public sector can account its money by generally accepted accounting practice. It's actually in the budget documents. It's done by generally accepted accounting practice in one section, and there's a footnote saying, oh, this is a mainly academic interest. The legislature pays no attention to it. It should be the starting point for the legislature. The second comment is I was very intrigued and taken with the notion for the Constitutional Convention, the Bay Area Council's proposal, that in the end they gave up on because they couldn't get support. That leads me to my question, which is, assuming that your ideas are good, how do we get there from here? Given the gridlock in the political process now, how could we
I mean, I guess I'm the pessimist, so why don't we start with me? I don't think we're anywhere close to there, and you know, Mark can probably talk about some of the mechanisms and how you do it, but I think it requires years of getting the public to a place where it's ready. The public isn't ready. The public is badly misinformed. It's being misinformed as we speak by two candidates for governor who run ads that actually tell stories that actually take us away from an understanding of what we're facing. So it needs, you know, the public thinks that prisons is the #1 thing that the state spends money on, when it's, you know, education by far. I mean, it would require a lot of money and a lot of time to get the public in a place where, you know, it understands basically just how things work, actually do work. And it's hard because state government is not the thing that most people follow first. They follow national politics, national government, they do it all. But that's how you get to that. And I am of the, you know, some of you know my mother, and I'm my mother's child, and we're both believers in, you know, that it often takes disasters to produce things. And in this state, you know, the history is that we have made big changes after terrible, terrible things have happened. We got initiative and referendum and the progressive movement in the state as a direct consequence of the earthquake and fire in San Francisco in 1906. That terrible convention in 1878 and 79 came after a decade of financial panics and calamities where, you know, by some estimates, half of Californians at one point or another lost most of their wealth. You know, so I take great heart in the projections of the seismologists at Caltech that we're due for a really terrible earthquake. I think it will take something terrible. Maybe, when I'm an optimist, maybe this situation we're in, this economic crisis and related crisis, is the thing that spurs us. But I've been disheartened that it hasn't seemed to change the conversation yet. And I think changing the conversation is sort of the first step. But if we get people to the framework, I mean, you know, then I don't think it's so hard. I mean, it's just getting people to realize that you've got this sort of perverse system that's very stuck. And you know, we're a state with great strengths. We're a dynamic state, dynamic economy. And you know, if we get out our wing and have just a sort of coherent system, you know, I think this is a state, its best days are ahead of us. But I'm just very pessimistic about our ability to bridge that gap to get there.
Yeah, I agree with Joe that, you know, we're not there yet. But, you know, we're also, this is a kind of disaster when you think about what we're doing to ourselves in California. And we live in a world which we have had something that the rest of the world wants. The kind of economic growth we've seen in California, the quality of life that, you know, that we either grew up with here in the case of Joe or came to enjoy in my case, and I'm sure in the case of many of you. A lot of the rest of the world wants this and is doing things to get it. They are investing in their children. They are investing in their infrastructure. The governor was just off riding I believe, a high-speed rail train in China. I mean, China's building 42 high-speed rail lines. You know, we're trying to figure out how to build one in California. We are, you know, at this moment of disaster when people are doing all these things, you know, we can't fund our government. We're cutting back the number of days our children are going to school. We're closing kids out of the university. I mean, if this is not a disaster, folks, I don't know what is. I mean, the building may not be trembling yet, but the termites are in the foundation. And so we, you know, if enough Californians come to realize that, we can do it. In terms of just the practical issues, to make the kind of big changes we're talking about in California requires either creating a constitutional revision, which the legislature can initiate. They can either do the revision themselves or, as in several times in the past, create a revision commission that draws up changes in our governing system and then submits it as a whole to voters for an up or down vote. Or there's the alternative of constitutional convention, which under current law can only be called by the legislature, can be proposed by the legislature and called by the voters. But the Bay Area Council last year had measures in which they would change the Constitution, allow voters themselves to call a constitutional convention. I don't know which route we may take. I think probably the revision commission is an easier and more well-defined way requires getting our political leaders in California to do something, which requires you to be in motion. Their democracy is sometimes called self-government. There's not a lot of self-government in California these days. We've left it to others. It's going to take a change in behavior, a people's movement like we had, to some extent with the progressives, even a greater extent with Prop 13, when there were a lot of Californians in motion that changed the state very fundamentally. We need something like that again, and I don't know whether it's an earthquake or just this crisis, but that's what it's going to take. Mike?
Mark, you often say that there are vested interests that have so much invested in the current dysfunction. Can you speak a little bit about what different groups would have to give up each together, like a Prop 98, for example, that seems to hold on, preventing them from moving?
Yeah, I mean, everybody who's got power in California's got a hostage in the Constitution. It's whether it's, as Mike said, the left has got Prop 98, the right has got Prop 13, and all these 2/3 votes. The people who oppose gillnet fishing, I mean, they've got gillnet fishing in the Constitution ban. I mean, we have almost everything in our Constitution. I mean, people are going to, these powerful groups are going to need to think that the situation is so bad that they're willing to consider giving up some of what they have, or at least putting it on the line where actually it can be changed by voters. You wouldn't have to give it up. We can take Prop 13 out of the Constitution and put it in statute and say, okay, from now on, the Prop 13 rules are subject to legislation. If the people who want to change them win the election, they get to change them. And if the people who want to keep them win the election, they get to keep them. That's how democracy is supposed to work. But we've got to get to the point where people think the deadlock is so bad that they're at least willing to fight out those issues again rather than keeping winning them on the fact that they won them 30 years ago.
Jerry?
I appreciate your conversation, and it's very depressing. From this side, it's very depressing. Now, we have a model for change because that's what the Governor Hiram Johnson did by starting the initiative process. So how did he get away with it? How did he do that? Because he had to get the legislature to change. How did he do it? I know he was a controversial guy.
He was, I'm a sort of revisionist. I'm not a fan. I've read all his papers. He was a racist and a Semite, and sort of enthralled with eugenics, but he had certain advantages. There was certainly a determination. I mean, most of the people in that state at the time, about half the people in the state lived in and around San Francisco. And they had all lost their homes and businesses, including him. And that sort of, gave them a certain organizing oath and a certain impatience that was very helpful at that time. The system had changed slightly. It opened up. He could not have been elected 4 years earlier. He's an outsider to politics, in the sense that he'd never run for office before. His father was a corrupt member of the state legislature, actually. There's a wonderful birthday card from the father to the son when Hiram's in office where he says, son, I don't agree with the thing you're doing, but I delight in your success in getting it done. He won an election with an enormous mandate, and even though he was a Republican, he ran with lots of other sort of different kinds of Republicans who had a movement that had been at work for a decade, had done a lot of work, had a lot of money behind it, and managed to change things. And he did things very quickly. He was elected in November of 1910, and there were 23 constitutional amendments passed at a special election in October of 1911. So he quickly seized a mandate and did it. I'm not sure his example applies today. He's not, I think any of these governors, Warren, Johnson, faced with this system, would find it very difficult to maneuver. It really, we are really the authors of the system, and it requires us to unwind it. And it would require something galvanizing of attention and effort to do it. That's and I don't know what that if that thing is. Because if it was, would suggest doing it. But I do think that, so what has to happen is long-term education campaigns to convince people and to move public opinion. And there are folks who do that in this state. I mean, the California Teachers Association does, public opinion campaigns that last 5 and 10 years and have moved public opinion on different things. Convince people of a lot of things, some of them true, some of them not true. But I think that's what we're looking at, and I think there's some effort. There are things going on. There are people trying to do these things. Organizations like California Forward and the like trying to do it. But
Ron?
Given the bitter partisanship and the simple answer sound bites, it doesn't seem like consensus on any of these issues is going to come right away. Let me raise a couple of ghosts from when I was in college and you weren't even born yet. One of them was one person, one vote. That's not what we called it then. And the other was Brown versus the Board of Education. What's the likelihood of the courts bringing about a tectonic shift in the way California is governed, particularly by striking down super majorities?
I think it's unlikely. I don't think there is there are many constitutional principles by which you can, federal principles you could overturn these provisions in the state constitution. The thing about the book, and we tried to write this, as Joe said, we never talked about policy issues. This was entirely about, okay, let's think about, how did we get in this fix, and how might we change the governing system, not the policy, but the governing system, so that everybody might have a fair shot at their changes. And one of the things that struck me so far, maybe Joe disagrees, but we've been now running around, for about 6 weeks, et cetera, and our book is starting to be read and reviewed in various places. I mean, we've gotten very nice reviews from the Wall Street Journal, from the American Prospect. We're going and speaking to liberal groups that love the book, but we're talking to some of the big conservative names in California, and they like the book too. There is, I think, apart from all partisan differences about policy, about how much we ought to spend on this or tax on that, or about issues of race and all the things the Tea Party is raising, there has been, I think, to me, gratifying and surprising sense that the ideas we propose here are acceptable, might work for both conservatives and liberals.
I would just add to the partisanship question. That's one thing that I've thought a lot about. I spent a lot of time, my Bruce book was about Governor Schwarzenegger. I spent a lot of time talking to him, following him over the last 7 years. I think he's had an approach that for most of the time has been nonpartisan, and he's tried a lot of different things and changed his mind in a lot of different ways. And I've come to the conclusion, and I think this book and our solutions reflect this, that there's almost a theory behind a lot of the political reform movement in the state. It's kind of the theory of the magic moderate, that if you just elect more moderates, you get more people in the middle in, that things happen. And I'm a moderate, I'm declined the state. I covered both political parties and long enough to loathe them both. And it's true. I mean, we moderates were smarter, better looking than you grubby partisans. But electing us to office, more of us to office, we're not possessors of magic. We can't, it's not going to ultimately get to a conference, particularly in a time where the people are more partisan. I mean, even the decline in state numbers, when you really look at those declining states, a lot of my fellow declining states really almost always vote with one party or the other. It's a partisan time, and I think instead of knocking our heads against that wall, which a lot of the good government folks in California continue to do, we need to recognize that these partisan differences and then create a system that creates majority accountability. So, if the one group of partisans in charge, we can see clearly who it was made decisions on budget and taxation, and when those things go badly, we have an election system that is flexible enough to allow us to punish them and vote them out. I think we have to sort of, I think Mark and I think we agree on this, that we're very hopeful and somewhat frustrated that the sort of good government folks have not sort of gotten past this fixation on the moderates and gotten to sort of dealing with the reality of, a world with MSNBC and Fox News and red and blue, and just make a system that works and channels those energies in a productive way rather than obscuring them. Who's responsible, as you have in a 2/3 budget and taxation scheme?
I guess that leads me to how do you create that groundswell? Because there doesn't seem to be a grassroots movement here. California Forward is more of a think tank. The Bay Area is more led by a few people. So I don't see the groundswell. Are there references in your book to blogs or to organizations that are grassroots and sophisticated in organizing this? Because it's not going to come from moderates. It's not going to come from the Democrats or Republicans. It's going to come from us. But we need some mechanisms to organize.
Yeah, it's going to require people creating a movement. I mean, the first, what we offer in the book is the only thing that we know how to do. We're storytellers and analysts. We thought the best thing we could, our contribution would be to try to expand, to tell some new stories, true stories about California, because as Joe said, everything we talk about is pretty much in California politics. The stories that get told in the campaign commercials, and they get told in the stump speeches are absolutely wrong on both the left and the right. They don't reflect our current reality. So, what we tried to do is, first of all, to tell some stories that actually help people understand exactly where we are in California, and then to offer this, vision, which, as we launched into it, we recognized, it's pretty pie in the sky. You don't expand, you get a conversation going unless you are willing to push a little bit and say, listen, people, this is what would work. This is what's possible. And as I said, Joe thinks I'm too much of an optimist sometimes, but I'm an evidence-based person, and I've been struck by the number of people, who I thought would look at this book and say, who said, that's really interesting, that's really smart, we ought to think about doing this. I mean, that's how it's, I think that's how it starts. That's what we can offer the conversation. It's up to the rest of you to do it.
I actually have a specific answer, which is not in the book, to that. If I were organizing this, and I don't want to be the person organizing this, I prefer to be on the sidelines throwing my spitballs at the people doing so. But if I were doing it, I would organize around, I would use the issue of education to organize on this. It's the most natural path, the way that binds us together. It's the biggest thing that state government does. It's central to every bit of the conversation. And there are some examples of success of good organizing and good organizing in political campaign context. I think the best example of the best example, and it requires more study, is the success that LAUSD has had in winning a series of very large bond measure campaigns. And when you look at their success, they figured out how to get old white folks, mostly old white women, to vote to build schools for brown kids, and figuring out, taking that apart and using some of the lessons from the people who worked on that. And I'm not saying it was the best campaign or they needed all that money or we need $578 million schools, but figuring out how they did that, I think that's sort of the beginning of there was real citizen engagement. Those were fairly high turnout elections by LA standards. And I mean, I think education, that issue connects enough people as to be the framework for doing it. I'm sorry to the Greens in the audience who are probably thinking I should be in the environment, but I would choose education.
Great.
It seems that California's system is very complicated. So we have a state assembly and state senate. I bet you most Californians couldn't identify who their representatives were. Are states that do it more simply, that have unicameral legislature, are they more effective in terms of government?
There's only one unicameral legislature, which is Nebraska, which is also the only nonpartisan legislature in the country. They don't elect people by party labels, although if you go to Nebraska at election time, they don't have any party labels, but some people's signs are red and some people's signs are blue. And apparently everybody in Nebraska knows who the Democrats and Republicans are. So that's sort of a charade. But the unicameral legislature, actually the political science to look at it, it seems to work very well. In fact, we suggest it in the book, because part of our series of fixes to moving to multi-member districts, et cetera, for those to work, you really need to have a unicameral legislature of at least, in California it would be 120 members if we combine them. Actually, in the book, we offer a model in which we have 360 members, because most Californians don't understand this. Our legislative districts in California are the largest in the country. They're not only the largest, but an assembly district in California is 3 times larger than the next largest state, Texas, in population. We have nearly 500,000 people in an assembly district, 3 times larger than the next largest, 10 times larger than the average of the rest of the state. Now, this is making nostalgia. I live in Wisconsin. When you're a member of Wisconsin, it's called the House, but was somebody who you ran into in the grocery store. His son sat next to me in English class in 11th grade. At every high school football game in Wisconsin, there's a member of the legislature shaking hands, if not 2, at the gate. There's a different relationship between when you have smaller legislative districts. Now, California's too big to have districts as small as in most states. I mean, we'd have to have 3,000 people in the legislature. But in the book, our system is set up so there are 360, which at least begins to bring people closer together and to do that. So unicameral is part of the fix. I agree.
And I would just add that because people don't know what district they're in or who their person is, that's one of the reasons we suggest multi-member districts, sort of loosely based on the regions of the state, because you know what region you live in. And that creates a big contest, a campaign that I think is also likely to be covered by media and get media scrutiny for the value that it adds, because now an LA station that covers one assembly district is saying, is turning off the rest of its audience, a huge part of its audience. You have a big regional campaign, that's someone everyone would follow, and there'd be Center for Our Media, which is still largely regionally organized, to cover that big contest. As the Democrats and Republicans, in LA there'd be more Democratic representatives than Republicans, but there'd be some question in the system. We suggest how many, and there'd be pressure on the Republicans to run up their numbers and to limit their losses here, and Democrats to run up their numbers here. So you'd have a real contest worth following.
I was into the role of third parties. You mentioned the Greens. I have to be Green, gotta say. In this process, do they stand to gain by your introducing proportional representation and the like? Now, could they be a vehicle to support your initiatives and the like? Because I don't know what power they would have, but at least something that potentially a force there that you might explore.
Yeah, I would hope so. I wrote an earlier a paper with a colleague at the American Foundation about the legislative changes, and Mike Feinstein, who's here in the front row from Santa Monica, invited us down, and we've talked about. We've had a lot of interest from Greens, but also from other minor parties, because it's a way that their voices could be heard. Actually, the original paper that I did, and that we sort of incorporated parts of this in the book, a political scientist up at Cal Poly presented a paper in April at a political science convention where they actually took our model and tested it against voting patterns in California and ran simulations, and showed, in fact, that the model would end with probably 5 different parties being represented in the legislature: Democrats, Republicans, Green, Libertarian, and sort of a Tea Party-ish Christian evangelical. I mean, that would be much more representative of the real shape of California's electorate, and that's what legislative bodies are supposed to be. Now they would then have to come together, but we'd make it easier for them to come together because they don't have to get a majority and not a supermajority to do most things. They'd be accountable, as Joe said. Every vote would count, because Republicans would run a campaign in Los Angeles, because if you could up your vote by 100,000, and you might end up with another seat. We should probably just take maybe 2 more, and then we'll sign.
2 points on the back.
I had a question. What's your estimate as to the percentage of eligible voters that are going to vote in November? And just to remind everybody, the Greens have some great candidates, including Laura Wells for governor. So there are other options. Thank you.
you know, the Secretary of State of the state we were talking to recently, he said it's not going to be so bad. It's not going to be the worst ever, but it could be very low. I mean, you know, in the primaries, it was, you know, it was almost 3 in 4 people who registered to vote did not vote. When you think of eligible adults, it's even smaller than that. So, you know, it was, you know, Brown and Whitman each had fewer than 2 million votes, and almost 13 million people did not vote. I mean, anyone who argues that that's a popular mandate, I think, is kidding themselves. It's actually a strong vote. I'm not sure that having a small number, if you believe in reform, having a small number of people voting and showing up is a bad thing. It actually may be a good thing. I mean, with the risk. I mean, ultimately, to do some of these things, you know, if you call a constitutional convention, for example, if you want to do that, you need to go to the people. And remember, the number of votes cast for governor in the state is the denominator in the equation, and setting the standard for how many signatures you need to gather to get something on the ballot. So even if you show up to vote and you don't vote for governor, you're actually making it easier and cheaper for anyone who wants to come in and move towards reform at the ballot to do that for the next 4 years. You know, fewer votes for governor, fewer signatures to get on the ballot, less money to get on the ballot. You know, I'm not advocating that, but it's a thing worth noting. But I think, you know, a turnout of, you know, we could see a turnout in the 30s, you know, in this, and that's you know, very, very, very low. Miriam, I think had a question in the back.
Two quick questions. One, California Forward. I'm curious what your impression of them is, and whether you, because you sort of said things that were mixed there, and what their prospects are. And the second is a perhaps more negative question, or more depressing one. You said that it takes catechism, you know, hitting rock bottom before anything changes. As far as I can tell, the changes that you mentioned that came about as a result of hitting rock bottom in the past were not ones that you would characterize as being positive. Is that correct?
Actually, no, I disagree with that. I mean, I think, you know, the initiative and referendum, et cetera, was a reasonable response. I'm a believer in direct democracy. Our particular system that we created in California was badly flawed. It was too inflexible, but I don't think it was a bad thing that we adopted it. I don't think Proposition 13 was a bad thing either. I mean, it dealt with a real problem that the state leaders couldn't deal with. I mean, people were paying property taxes that were out of proportion to their ability to pay. And liberals in the legislature and other places began fighting against the system back in the 1960s. You know, conservatives joined in on the left and the right their efforts to change this, and they just couldn't get it done in Sacramento. And so, you know, a lot of bad things came out of Prop 13. I mean, I think, you know, the parts of the book that we didn't have a chance to talk about tonight will open some eyes about, because I think the largest impact of Prop 13 is actually the governance changes, centralizing power in Sacramento, making it more difficult with the 2/3 vote, empowering public employee unions to control local government. Those are bad things that came out of it. But the good thing came out of Prop 13, and people took something in their own hands. So, you know, when people are in motion, there's always danger. That's just the reality of history, but the alternative, people not in motion, you know, there's danger today too, so.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I didn't phrase it quite accurately
No,
in terms of good and bad, but I think that the things that you're saying are locking us in, and our problems and obstacles right now are the very changes that came out of it.
But they were because of failure to think about these systematically. We're advocating that we do it, this time do it with a thought to creating, to have what we never had, a founding in California. That if that is our obligation, not just to fix this one little problem, but it's actually to rethink and have a real founding. I suppose I didn't answer the California Forward question. But, you know, I think, you know, having California Forward is a great thing. You know, it was, I don't know if a lot of you know, California Forward is an organization that was created by 3 of the big foundations in California. They put money in to try to build an agenda for reform in California. I think the problem from our point of view with California Forward is that they thought too small, that they've gone after these small silver bullets without a sort of and you know, believe in the magic moderate to some extent, and that same energy needs to be put behind what we're proposing, I think, bigger. And that's one of the reasons why we've offered these solutions. We just thought the conversation was too small, and not equal to our situation.
That is such a wonderfully diplomatic answer. Yeah, I guess I would say more plainly, they spent a ton of money. I'm not sure what they have to show for it. I think they get the thing right in they've organized it's sort of an interest group for reform, but they've hired, you know, all of these key legislative staffers, behind the scenes players, the top political consultants, all the people who are authors of it and make their living from the system, and I think are unlikely to change it. And I say that as someone who's, you know, who has prospered under this dysfunctional system. I'm here, you know, this is my second book out of this terrible era. I mean, you know, don't fix it too fast, you know. But I think they're sort of conflicted in that way. But you know,
What are their small ideas that you're talking about? What are their small ideas?
they're
Performance-based budgeting, eliminating the 2/3 vote on the budget, but not for taxes. In fact, they propose to actually extend the 2/3 vote to increases in fees.
Two-year budget cycle.
Those are the things.
Two-year budget cycle.
Redistricting commission, which is already passed. They supported the top 2 primary, which is going to have little or no impact on our politics, except perhaps to make money more important in our campaigns. So they've gone for these small bore kind of things, some of which we've already done, which, you know, as we say in the book, for instance, the redistricting reform, you know, has the heartbreak already built in. You know, it's just not going to change our politics in any fundamental way. So that's why we've tried to push beyond that. So thank you all for coming. We're happy to sign books. I'm glad to be here.